Do we know the numbers that we're talking about? How much the cut, how much the increase?
We don't know the cuts yet. What I know is that it's not going to be a very large one. It's not going to be something like 500,000 barrels per day. It's going to be less than that. For the increase, yes, Russia and Kazakhstan combined will be increasing by about 75,000 barrels per day. And this is because it has been very cold and they need more oil for domestic consumption, so for power generation really rather than for exports. What I have also been advised is that this isn't that Saudi Arabia is making space for Russia and Kazakhstan. So if you look at what the increase would have been, is say if OPEC Plus had agreed to 500,000 barrels per day of increase this month, the combined increase between the two countries would have been about 150,000 barrels per day. So they get 50% of that now. But let's say come April, the whole group decides to increase by 500,000 barrels per day. Russia and Kazakhstan will only get 50% of their allocated volume. So all they're trying to do is they're giving Russia and Kazakhstan a bit of an early increase, but it doesn't mean they can increase more than the others eventually. It's just they're just being given it a little bit earlier than the others, that's all.
Amrita, there were questions early on about whether or not OPEC Plus all on the same page. Are you suggesting that everybody is on the same page? How sort of cohesive is this group?
I think the group is very cohesive. I think, these are very small disagreements that tend to get blown out of proportion because essentially nobody's disagreeing on the fact that demand is weak. Nobody's disagreeing with the fact that the new variant of the virus could be very, it could spread and, the kind of UK-like lockdown could be everywhere in Europe. But it's just a slight difference in terms of how you're positioning. So Russia's point is that, look, it's $50 oil. If we don't start increasing now, what's your downside? What's the down? It's a maximum of $5, let's say, right? Like given the vaccines are around the corner. Saudis are being more cautious. They tend to be more conservative, and their point of view is that, did we forget what happened in March or April that we underestimated the virus? What's the rush? So nobody's really disagreeing in the bigger picture. It's purely about when do we start raising production. Now, I will say this is going to be an issue right throughout this year. This is going to be the biggest challenge for the group about, timing these increases. And I think, and especially remember that Iran is going to be coming back at some point this year as well. That's very much the expectation. But yeah, it's not, the group is absolutely cohesive. It's about figuring out when do they need to bring barrels back without crushing the market, but equally not giving up market share.
I'm glad you brought up Iran. There is a headline crossing the terminal that says that a Saudi foreign minister says that Arab states will fully restore Qatar ties and that they have to have a united stance on Iran. How does that geopolitical picture play into the nitty-gritty of the oil market dynamic?
So I don't think that the Qatar, obviously the normalization of relationships there impacts the oil market directly because, Qatar left OPEC as well. It's a very small oil producer. But yeah, of course, from the regional stability point of view, again, we've seen UAE, for instance, align itself a little bit more with Israel as well. And remember when there were attacks on Saudi Arabia, UAE were very much the first to kind of send almost a kind of an envoy to Iran and saying, okay, look, yes, we understand the risks and threats, and so let's just talk about it. So Iran is going to feature quite heavily in the region. You've seen them enriching uranium above 20% as well. Already, that's just a precursor because they just want to talk. They want to bring exports back to the market. That's their objective. That's why they're ratcheting up certain things in the region to get Biden's attention. So I think it's going to be interesting for the next few months because, again, Biden has a lot on his plate when he gets into the White House, domestic agenda, and COVID being the biggest one, right? And that's why Iran just wants to make sure that they aren't forgotten, if that makes sense. But yeah, we are expecting Iranian oil to start coming back to the market from the second half of this year.
Amrita, one of the conversations that Alex and I have been having today is whether or not the United States is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks behind where Europe is now. Europe is locking down, as you know. We certainly feel it here in London, but Germany doing the same thing. If that were to be the case, kind of how much do you think we need to take out of the current oil price? We're at $50 a barrel on WTI. How much lower could that number be?
Yeah, and this is the million-dollar question, right? Like, I think there's a lot of speculative money in the market, or rather passive lend in the market, because everybody's expecting the vaccine. And yes, that will absolutely make it a much more brighter future, but that's for the second half of the year. Maybe Q2 at the earliest. The Q1 picture does look pretty grim. If you are talking about UK-style lockdowns across Europe, having said that, Germany and Italy are already in lockdowns. I will say for Europe versus where demand was in December, how much lower can it really go? Not very much, right? We were in some form of lockdown everywhere. I think the real question is if similar lockdowns happen in the U.S., then of course we could be losing $10+ quite quickly. But I just don't think there is appetite for that at all, because again, the narrative gets confused with, or rather for the people, everybody's been cooped up for a year, and then with vaccines coming out, it's very, very difficult for governments to really enforce lockdowns. So, but yes, if it were to happen, the downside is enormous, $10+, I would say, if not more. But I don't think it's going to be as drastic as March, April of this year, like we are seeing in the UK now.
Amrita, before we let you go, what part of the curve or what time spread or differential is not accurately priced for the environment that we're in right now?
I personally think the time spreads, say for Brent, they are a little bit too strong versus the physical fundamentals, in the sense that, you know, we have to absorb a lot of the oil that's been destocked. Fundamentals, like Guy said as well, European markets, I mean, demand's really poor here. Asia's still holding up well. So I would expect Brent to be in a shallow contango, but it's still holding around flat. So there's a little bit of downside there. I also think flat price is too high right now, because it's being driven by sentiment rather than the fundamentals right here, right now. But I equally don't think we're going to correct lower unless there's a bad news on the vaccine. This is very much being driven by that expectation. I think people almost want to discount that Q1 is going to look very ugly, and I think that's the problem we have. So the physical market has to weaken to represent that reality that the Q1 fundamentals are going to be very poor.